Welcome. We are doing a workshop now on how to make decisions in a response to intervention type situation. All right, so just a reminder of the pyramid of the response to intervention. Sometimes there are three levels wherein that you have tier one, which tends to be global, tier two that tends to be targeted, and targeted to small groups, and tier three that tends to be individualized. There are other ways of doing this, but those are the ones that's kind of how the tiers work in a multi-tiered system of support. So at each level, there needs to be certain things, three different things for each level. One is you have to have some form of assessment, and that assessment needs to be linked to the intervention given, and the intervention needs to be tied back to the problem. And so you often will use an assessment to determine what the problem is. And so that's at tier one, where you're trying to identify which children need more specialized care or intervention, and then not just do they need it. So a lot of times that first decision point is actually just a screener, identifying the children who need help. But it should also be an opportunity for you to figure out exactly what kind of problems they're having. It's not enough just to say that they're having a problem in reading. You need to decide, is it phonemic awareness, or is it prosody and fluency, or whatever it is. So this tier one, the general intervention that was given to everybody, this child, some sort of assessment determined that they have problems in that area and what those specific problems are. At the tier two level, you take and build an intervention around the problems that were identified between tier one and tier two. And then you should be doing some sort of progress monitoring for your assessment. And that's going to be a big part of the discussion we're going to have now. And then at the decision point, the decision point between tier two and tier three, that is when we need to have some method of deciding, did the person respond to the tier two intervention or not? And if they failed to respond to the tier two intervention, maybe they need to be placed in special education. And so there would be assessments then to determine their need for special education. I do want to note that there is also a 4-tier model that is available. So I want for you to get a chance to see that. And, it's kind of similar to the 3-tier model. It's just that tier one is still for, just general everybody. Tier two is small group. Tier three is usually more individualized, but still within regular education. And tier four is then special ed. So these decision points are not different. Between tier one and tier two is the same as what we just talked about, some sort of screener and identifying the exact issues. Tier two to tier three, the decisions are still the same. You've implemented the intervention and you've looked to see whether or not the child is responding to the intervention through progress monitoring. Then you hit a decision point, and then based off of the data, then you would decide if they need more individualized but still general education services. And then tier three, you would still do more progress monitoring where you set up the intervention, and then the next decision will be special ed. So tier two and tier three have very similar assessment methodology and decision point methodology within a 4-tier framework instead of a 3-tier framework. So you may see either. So the point of today's materials and lessons are not on the specific assessments being used or the interventions being used. Instead, we're going to discuss different ways to make these decisions, particularly the decision point between tier two and tier three. And in a 4-tier model, that might be the decision point between 3 and 4. But this is the one right here we're really focusing on, is between tier 2 and tier 3. How do you determine if the child is failing to respond to the intervention? So I just have a little quip here about, quip is the wrong word, but some information here about what the law says. And I'm just going to highlight that In order to make an LD diagnosis, the school must permit the use of a process based on the child's response to scientific, research-based intervention. So with that in mind, this isn't very vague. It doesn't say which research-based intervention. It doesn't say how you determine if the child responded through certain kind of assessment tools, and it doesn't say what kind of method you have to use in order to determine if the response happened. So that's one of the reasons that I'm teaching all 5 methods. There are 5 different methods for making those decisions at the decision point. So this set of materials that we're going to be discussing today go over each of these, potentially each of these 5 areas. The one area that I am not going to spend quite as much time on is single subject design, because I have additional learning materials in that area. Plus, I mean, this could be an entire course. So the single subject design information is going to be kind of brief. There are going to be 2 areas that we discuss that are more graphical, and some states, including the state of Florida, requires not only an interpretation as part of the data analysis, as in some sort of statistical, have they actually improved, but also a graphical representation. So that can either be done, and the 2 of the 5 methods that provide a graphical representation are single subject design and graphing data. So those 2 are something for you to consider. And then the other 3 we need to discuss. There is a similarity for all 5 of these methods, and so there's no way that you can say, well, I didn't get any baseline data, so I'm going to use a different method. All the methods require baseline data. Ideally, and we'll discover, you'll discover this as we discuss more about effect size, you need 3 data points for baseline data, and you also would need data points afterwards. So ideally, you would have 3 post data points as well. So, you also, for all of these methods, you have to implement a research-based intervention. Again, the nature of this particular discussion today is not on selecting a research-based intervention or determining if it's effective for, for whoever it is that did that research, or, that's not today. The assumption is that you have correctly chosen a research-based intervention that's linked to the assessment data indicating what the child's problem is. You also need to collect some sort of progress monitoring data. And so in general, progress monitoring data is interpreted to be, say, 1 data point a week for as many weeks as the intervention takes place. Loosely, you can also say it would be maybe 1 or 3 data points post. But for the most part, progress monitoring data is considered multiple data points throughout the intervention. And then they all compare baseline data to progress monitoring data. So as you can see, every single one of these methods require all of the parts of the response intervention model: assessment tools, interventions, and some method of determining data analysis.